Hi, I'm Bob. Welcome to the series Economics in Real Life. Some days ago, I revisited a movie, A Beautiful Mind. The movie tells the story of the Nobel Prize winner in economics, John Nash. He was an extremely intelligent mathematical genius, but suffered from a mental disorder. One day, while chatting with colleagues in a bar, he was inspired to propose the famous Nash Equilibrium in game theory. John Nash proposed the equilibrium theory of multiplayer games in his doctoral thesis in 1950, when he was 23 years old. In 1994, he and two other game theory experts won the Nobel Prize in economics. Today, I would like to talk about game theory, a branch of economics, and one of its classic cases, the prisoner's dilemma. Game theory is the study of strategic interaction among economic agents or players. The individuals, firms, or countries who participate in the game are called the players of the game. The prisoner's dilemma is a story like this. Two robbery suspects were caught. If both suspects admit to the robbery, they will be sentenced to 4 years in prison. If neither suspect admits to the robbery, the prosecutor does not have enough evidence and can only charge them with a lighter crime of illegally carrying a gun, and they will be sentenced to 2 years in prison. The prosecutor wants to find a way to make them confess. The two suspects were separated. The prosecutor told the first suspect that if you confess, and the other suspect does not, as a reward, you will receive reduced sentence and will be sentenced to 1 year, while your accomplice will be sentenced to 5 years. If you do not confess, and the other suspect does confess, then you will be sentenced to 5 years, and the other be sentenced to 1 year. If you were the first suspect, what would you do? You face two choices: confess or do not confess. You will consider the impact of the choices made on the sentence. In the game analysis, we usually use tables to show the choices of people participating in games and the consequences they bring. The table is called the matrix form in game theory. This table shows the choices of suspects and the corresponding sentences. Each suspect has two choices: confess or not confess. The 4 cells of the table shows the consequences. The first number is the sentence of the first suspect, and the second number is the sentence of the second suspect. The numbers in the upper left cell indicate that if both suspects confess, the first suspect will be sentenced to 4 years, and the second suspect will also be sentenced to 4 years. The upper right cell indicates that if the first suspect confesses and the second suspect does not, the first suspect will be sentenced to 1 year and the second suspect will be sentenced to 5 years. The numbers in the lower left cell indicate that if the first suspect does not confess and the second suspect does confess, the first suspect will be sentenced to 5 years and the second suspect will be sentenced to 1 year. The numbers in the lower right cell indicate that if both suspects do not confess, they will both be sentenced to 2 years. If we were the first suspect, we would think like this. If the second suspect confesses, I should choose to confess, so that I would be sentenced to 4 years, which is better than choosing not to confess and be sentenced to 5 years. We draw a line under the number 4. Then we consider, if the second suspect does not confess, my best choice is still to confess so that I would be sentenced to 1 year, which is better than choosing not to confess and being sentenced to 2 years. We draw a line under the number 1. We found that whether or not the second suspect chooses to confess, it's best for the first suspect to confess. The prosecutor said exactly the same thing to the second suspect, so he would also make the same analysis and choose to confess as well. As a result, both suspects would end up confessing and being sentenced to 4 years in prison. We call it a dilemma because they could have been given a lighter sentence of 2 years, but the game Equilibrium resulted in a heavier sentence of 4 years. There were several things to pay attention to in the prisoner's dilemma. First, both suspects make their decisions simultaneously. Simultaneously does not mean at the same time, but rather that the suspect cannot make its own choice after observing the other's choice. Second, the information obtained by the suspects is complete. Each suspect knows the available strategies the other suspect can choose and the corresponding results, that is, the payoffs. Therefore, they can compare different payoffs and choose the strategies that is most advantageous to them. Games with these two characteristics are called the static games of complete information. Third, the confession choices made by the two suspects are Nash Equilibrium. A Nash Equilibrium is a state in which no participant has an incentive to change her strategy when other participants do not change their strategies. In other words, in a Nash Equilibrium, each player's choice is her optimal choice given the other player's choice. In the example of the prisoner's dilemma, both suspects choose to confess is a Nash Equilibrium. Given that the other suspect does not change his strategy of confessing, the suspect's sentence will increase. If he changes his strategy from confessing to not confessing, neither player has the incentive to change his strategy. Fourth, the optimal choices individuals make in the game do not necessarily lead to globally or socially optimal outcomes. In the prisoner's dilemma, the globally or socially optimal strategy is for both suspects to not confess. It requires the players to cooperate or collude. You may ask, as long as the two players reach an agreement beforehand, can't they achieve the socially optimal solution? In theory, yes, but achieving cooperation or collusion requires some conditions. First, both parties must have the willingness and ability to reach an agreement. In the example of the prisoner's dilemma, the two robbers must have the opportunity to negotiate beforehand and agree to not to confess if caught. Second, and more importantly, the cooperation agreement must be self-enforceable. That is, the cooperation agreement must be binding and credible. In our prisoner's dilemma, if the suspects communicate beforehand and reach an agreement not to confess once caught, do you think they will stick to the agreement and not defect after being caught? If this is a one-time game, the answer is no. The suspects will not adhere to the agreement, but will make decisions based on maximizing their own interest, that is, choose to confess. Such an agreement is not credible. So, how can an agreement be made credible? If the game is played multiple times, the player who does not comply with the agreement will lose the opportunity to cooperate again in the future, and no peers will work with him because of his bad reputation. This will greatly reduce the possibility of violating the agreement. We can also analyze it using a table. Just now, we take the sentence as the outcome. We can convert the sentence into payoffs. The payoff of going to jail is negative. Using the same logic as before, we get the same Nash equilibrium. Next, let's take a look at how the changes in payoffs change the Nash equilibrium. Suppose the two suspects reach an agreement beforehand that if they were arrested, they would not plead guilty, and if anyone fails to comply with their promise, they will be punished after being released from prison. Then, the suspect's payoffs will change. If he pleads guilty, his payoff becomes a more negative number. For example, when both parties plead guilty, it becomes -6. When he pleads guilty, but the other party does not, his payoff becomes -3. The payoffs from pleading guilty are reduced by 2 because the suspect needs to consider that he will be punished after being released. Using the same logic to analyze the response of the suspects, we find that the first suspect's optimal choice is not to confess, regardless of whether the other suspect confesses or not. Similarly, the second suspect's optimal choice is also not to confess, regardless of whether the first suspect pleads guilty or not. The Nash equilibrium of the game is that both suspects do not plead guilty, and the corresponding Nash equilibrium payoff is that both suspects only serve 2 years in prison. Imposing a threat of punishment changes the payoffs of the game, and therefore the Nash equilibrium. Under credible agreement constraints, individuals' optimal choices are also the global or social optimal choices. Game theories all around us. In real life, we find that behind many problems is the prisoner's dilemma. For example, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, cooperates to limit oil production in order to maintain oil prices. But it is difficult to prevent member countries from increasing production. Another example is in the area of protecting marine fishery resources. How do we prevent the overuse of resources caused by the maximization of individual interests. A final example is in the area of how to control excessive emissions of carbon dioxide gas. From such problems, we can find the principles of the prisoner's dilemma. The players of the game has an incentive to deviate from the agreement in pursuit of maximizing their own interests. As a result, the Nash Equilibrium is not the optimal choice for society as a whole. How to achieve a credible and binding agreement is the key to tackling these problems. Thank you for watching this video and subscribing to my YouTube channel. See you next time.